The Holy Gospel, as it is recorded in Matthew. When Jesus heard about the beheading of his cousin John, he left Nazareth by boat and went to a deserted place to be alone. The crowds heard of this and followed him from their towns on foot. When Jesus disembarked and saw the vast throng, his heart was moved with pity, and he healed their sick. As evening drew on, the disciples approached Jesus and said, "This is a deserted place, and it's already late. Dismiss the crowds so they can go to the villages and buy some food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "There is no need for them to disperse. Give them something to eat yourselves." "We have nothing here," they replied, "but 5 loaves and a couple of fish." "Bring them here," Jesus said. Then he ordered the crowds to sit on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven, blessed the food, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, who in turn gave it to the people. All those present ate their fill. The fragments remaining, when gathered up, filled 12 baskets. About 5,000 families were fed. This is the gospel of Christ. When I was a teenager, I was always in a hurry. I wanted to see and do everything there was to see and do. When I was 19, I knew that I just had to get out there to see what the world had to offer. So with nothing more than a backpack, a 3-month Eurail pass, and $800 in traveler's checks, I boarded an airplane for Amsterdam. I was searching for adventure, and I was convinced that Europe held the excitement which I was looking for. Inside my backpack, I had a book that would, I believed, make all of my dreams possible. It was a book entitled Europe on $10 a Day. That's right, $10 a day. I was determined to make my $800 stretch the length and breadth of Europe. I was going to see it all. I was going to do it all. Well, it wasn't easy on that kind of budget. In fact, when I look back on it now, it was like a full-time job. It seems like such a lot of hard work. Up early in the morning, sightseeing all day long, meeting new people, fighting my way through the crowds of tourists, searching for cheap places to eat and even cheaper places to sleep. After 2 months of traveling from one European city to the next, I just couldn't face one more castle, one more museum, or one more art gallery. I figured that it was time for me to get away from the cities, so I headed for the Alps. After a long train ride from Munich, I arrived in the Swiss town of Interlaken. There I boarded a small train that would take me to the alpine village of Grunewald. The train was filled with tourists, anxious as we all were to fill our rolls of film, and we had rolls of film in those days, to fill those rolls with beautiful photographs of the spectacular scenery. When I arrived in Grunewald, I was told that the youth hostel was just about 3 kilometers from the station. So I and several other young people, backpackers all, we decided that we were just going to walk to the youth hostel. What we didn't know was that those 3 kilometers were straight up the side of a mountain. As we trudged up the mountain, we were embarrassed by the speed with which the villagers, 3 times our age, just passed us by. Despite our youth, those senior Swiss locals were much more adept at climbing than we were. When we finally arrived at the hostel, there was a lot of complaining about how tired we were. We were exhausted. Many of us were tired of the demands of traveling, too tired to be impressed by the fact that here we were in a beautiful Swiss chalet in the middle of the magnificent Alps. It was only 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but we collapsed onto our beds in the dormitory. I promptly fell asleep, and I didn't wake up until the very next morning. Breakfast tastes incredibly good when you eat it in a Swiss chalet surrounded by new friends you've only just met. People from all over the world with just two things in common: youth and incredible hunger and thirst for adventure. There was only one thing for us to do. We had to get closer to those mountains. So about a dozen of us decided to climb to the top of what is called the Glacier Gorge, so that we could get a close-up view of the famous Eiger Mountain. We'd been assured by the hostel manager that we could easily walk to the top of the glacier that lay just adjacent to the Eiger, and from there we would have the most magnificent view of this spectacular mountain. Well, right after breakfast, we set off. Newfound friends from the farthest reaches of the earth: Canada, South Africa, Tokyo, England, Finland, Australia, New York, and California. And there wasn't a single climber in the bunch. The first part of the journey was pleasant enough. The alpine meadows were delightful, and the conversation was playful. The switchback trail was a bit more of a challenge as our calf muscles began to feel the strain. But when we reached the cliffs, I started to wonder if we were actually up to the challenge. Before us lay a series of cliffs into which the Swiss had embedded a series of wooden ladders. My fear of heights began to surface, but I was determined to give at least the first cliff a try. So one by one we began to climb. Each rung of the ladder was a challenge, and I resolved not to look down. As I climbed hand over fist, step by step, my vision was firmly fixed on the butt of the climber above me. One rung at a time, I was going to get up that cliff. When all of us had safely negotiated the first ladder, several people, myself included, suggested that perhaps we were overreaching ourselves. Maybe the Glacier Gorge was more of a climb than we could handle. But the keeners in the group encouraged us to go on. After we had slowly made our way up half a dozen of these ladders, there was more dissension in the ranks, but we had come this far, so we headed towards the next ladder, and it was a doozy. We moved ever so slowly upwards. I resolved that I had had enough, and once I got to the top of this particular ladder, I was not going to go any higher. As I scrambled to the top, I was relieved that my climb, at least, was over. My legs were a little shaky as I straightened up and took a look around. It took my breath away. There we were on the top of a plateau right opposite the Eiger. We had made it to the foot of the Glacier Gorge. The view was magnificent. I was awestruck. And this once talkative little group of ours was silent as each of us tried to take it all in. I found a spot of grass and I sat down. The air was fresh and clear, the sun burned bright, and the snow glistened as though it were a sea of diamonds. Overwhelmed by the beauty, no one spoke a word. I wish I could share the wonder of that moment with you. It was a glimpse of the Creator's power and majesty. Everywhere I looked, I saw the evidence of divine splendor. It was truly a once-in-a-lifetime mountaintop experience. One of those rare moments when you are totally conscious of the presence of something so much bigger than yourself, something divine, something that has been described for generations as God. It was one of those moments that has the power to transform you. Well, eventually our silence gave way to slumber as we rested our weary selves. And when the warmth of the afternoon sun woke me from my slumber, my eyes tried desperately to adjust to the vivid colors all around me. Before me stood the Eiger. I looked out across this picture postcard Switzerland, and I marveled at the glory and majesty of creation. Slowly I became aware of my traveling companions. We had gathered together just a few hours earlier. We came from the farthest reaches of the earth, and together each of us felt the wonder of this experience. There on the top of a mountain, a ragtag group of travelers was transformed by a glimpse of divine creation. Without words, we began to dig around in our day packs for something to eat. With little or no preparation, we created a feast from what we were able to scrounge together. Out of the scarcity, from one pack came 2 apples, out of another, a crust of bread, some salami, lots of cheese, an orange, a banana, a few Swiss chocolate bars, and even a few bottles of red wine. In silence, we passed around the ingredients of our feast. I was conscious of the reality that we were in the presence of something much larger than we could possibly imagine, a divine presence, as we enjoyed this Holy Communion. It was just an impromptu meal shared without much forethought, but it was as holy a communion as I have ever partaken of. These past few months, we have not been able to gather together in our sanctuaries to share communion with one another. The journey back to worshiping in person seems even more insurmountable than climbing a mountain. Public health protocols surrounding in-person gatherings mean that for the foreseeable future, the rituals we have developed over 2 millennia, those rituals must be set aside. Even when we do go back to our sanctuaries, much of what so many of us have come to love about worshiping together will not be possible. There will be no warm, welcoming embraces, no singing, no passing the peace with hugs and kisses, probably no communion, or at the very least, no wine at communion, and definitely no sharing of all those goodies that we normally share after the formal worship is over. No coffee, no sandwiches, no cookies or cakes. And sadly, no more farewell embraces. As I contemplate staring out at a masked congregation from behind my own mask, you know, those Zoom squares, which for months now have been my only view of my beloved congregation, well, those screen images, those little boxes, they don't seem so bad anymore. During our lockdown, we have found new ways of being church, new ways of seeing the divine in one another, new ways of communing with one another. They may not exactly be the mountaintop experiences that we long for. But then I suspect that whatever the meal that Jesus and his followers shared by the lakeshore so long ago was, it came as an unexpected surprise. But it was indeed as sacred an experience as any ritual partaken of in the temple. It was just an impromptu meal shared without much forethought, and yet all those who partook of that feast did so in the presence of the divine. What made that experience sacred was the reality that they were in the presence of something much larger than any of us can possibly imagine, a divine presence. Becoming conscious of the divine presence, which is the source of all that is, nourished, grounded, and sustained Jesus' first followers, who were then able to meet the challenges of living under circumstances far harsher than we privileged North Americans can even begin to understand. I'm sure that each of us can recall sacred moments spent in the splendor of creation in which we we're conscious of the presence of something much greater than we can imagine. Many of us have been blessed to have experienced such sacred moments, aided by the rituals which have nourished generations of seekers of such divine encounters. Many of us have missed our familiar rituals and worship practices. We have been forced to find new ways of being church and new ways of encountering the divine. Well, for months now, seekers of the divine have flocked in numbers not seen for decades to worship services that are being offered over the internet. Services like this one. Screens of all sorts have been utilized as worship leaders have attempted to open seekers to the sacred mystery which many of us call God. Churches everywhere are reporting unprecedented numbers of viewers. Our own little congregation, our online offerings are engaging between 20 and sometimes 50 times more people than we were engaging before we had to close down our sanctuary. Church leaders of every denomination are asking all sorts of questions about what this means for the future of the church. The truth is, none of us really know. I can't help wondering what those 5,000 well-fed followers of Jesus actually knew about what was happening in and around them. The truth is, none of us really know any more than they did what the experience of the divine presence can lead to. We know that ragtag bunch of Jesus followers managed to change the world, and their impact continues to provide hope to millions and millions of people, generations upon generations after they ate their fill. My own life was forever changed after an impromptu meal on a mountaintop. To this very day, I am nourished by that long ago experience. So as I contemplate what the coming months and indeed years may bring to our shared hunger for the divine presence, I realize that even though so very much of what we have relied on over the years to nourish us may not be available to us, and so each and every one of us is going to have to reach into our pack of tricks, our pack of resources, our pack of talents, to discover and to offer what we can to provide nourishment to one another. Just last week, as new public health policies allowed for socially distant visiting with a larger group of people, I was blessed to share not one but 2 meals with 2 sets of dear friends. Now, figuring out the logistics of how to safely prepare and serve food to one another was complicated, and I'm sure we made a few mistakes. We certainly missed the warm embraces, but oh, how nourishing those gatherings were. Despite the challenges we faced, we were fed by one another. The love we shared nourished, grounded, and sustained me in ways beyond measure. As we look ahead to what may be, let us embrace these challenges. Let us dig deep into ourselves to discover what gifts we have to offer to nourish one another. Let us have the courage to grieve what may be lost without letting our grief keep us from discovering and partaking of new ways to nourish, ground, and sustain one another in the presence of the divine. Everywhere we look, there is evidence of divine splendor. Let us prepare the feast for one another, and let us partake together however, wherever, and whenever we can, trusting that the one we seek is ever ready to welcome us into the love, which is the mystery that we call God. Amen.